Brian was one of the sweetest clients I've ever had. He was a heavy-set African-American gentleman, mainly bald, missing a number of his front teeth. He was very, very quiet. In fact, most of the time we visited together, he wouldn't say much at all. He struggled to maintain eye contact. He would fidget with his fingers and stare down at the table between us. A lot of our conversations involved me asking him yes or no questions because anything more than that was too much for Brian to manage. The longest Brian would ever stay out with me was about an hour. When it was time for our visit to end, we had worked out this system where all he needed to do was put the phone down. I would know he was tired, and he wouldn't need to say anything. That was pretty much how we communicated. Even though Brian had some limitations, I still thought he was extremely charming. We were getting ready for a hearing to determine whether Brian was a person with intellectual disability. And we had a number of incredible witnesses, but one sticks out in particular. Brian was raised in Mississippi, and I got to know his ex-girlfriend pretty well during the investigation. She was the only girlfriend Brian ever had throughout his life, and all these years later, she was working as a high-level administrator at a historically Black university. She was smart and educated. She also almost married Brian. She loved him dearly, and she was willing to testify about his functioning. During the state's cross-examination of her, they asked some pretty embarrassing questions. In particular, they asked her about her sex life with Brian. They wanted to know who initiated because their argument was a person with intellectual disability couldn't be the person to initiate sex. We had prepared her for the possibility that might happen, and she really held her own in the face of being asked all those embarrassing things. It was really terrible to see her going through that on the stand. Brian was represented by a wonderful lawyer who knew that he needed to humanize everybody in the room. He asked her one last question. Can you tell us why you fell in love with Brian? Until that moment, Brian's head had been down throughout the hearing. He wasn't looking at anybody. All of these embarrassing things were being said about him, and he was just sitting there listening to it all. When the witness heard the question, she lit up, smiled, and said, "The first time I saw Brian, I thought he looked just like Denzel Washington." Brian looked up and smiled, and everybody in the courtroom started smiling and laughing. That moment, everybody in the room was reminded how it felt to fall in love. It's the moment when you see somebody and you think, oh my gosh, they're just like a movie star. And that was bringing humanity into the process. Her testimony changed the entire feel of that hearing. Just this very simple thing of being able to express to people that Brian was a person with experiences like anyone else. To stop dehumanizing him was what it took to sort of even out the playing field. After that, the bailiff didn't cuff Brian when they took him back to the holding cell. They started to make sure that he had water, and the judge seemed to be concerned about his well-being too. And that's mitigation.